right. Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by Antonio Wolf. He is a YouTuber, blogger, and easily one of the most intelligent and knowledgeable Hegelians I have come across on YouTube and just in general. So, Antonio, thanks for coming on. It's an honor to speak with you.
Thank you. I'm flattered. It's an honor to speak with you. I watched your videos before, actually. Just never reached out or anything. I have found a lot of your interviews with people are very good.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Hopefully this one will go just as good or even better. So today I guess recently, or I guess this year, you wrote an article called, I think it's From Atheism to Theism, and that will be linked in the description to this video. And it was really interesting to me, mostly because from myself personally, in terms of the Hegelians that I have spoken with or really dealt with and read, they are very rarely actual theists. I mean, like, especially the Žižekians, and really the only other, aside from you, the only Hegelian theist that I know is Riley Finley, who I know you've come across her videos because I saw her on your channel, or on your recommended channels list. So I guess just to start us off, maybe you could briefly, I know this is sort of a a big question to ask right away, but maybe you could briefly go over your journey from atheism to theism, and I guess the more difficult question to put succinctly, why did you end up becoming a theist? For what reason? Was it some sort of divine revelation or something else?
In this, I don't think I'm that atypical, or at least in the initial parts. I was raised in a Christian household. I think my mom never was part of a specific denomination that I'm aware of. The closest I think is probably Pentecostal. I went to church because I had to, but I never really had much of a connection to any of that, despite the fact that in the church, I'd be like the one who, for whatever reason, was always called up for read the passages during a service or whatnot. And people thought I was a very pious person. And that always bothered me because I was like, well, I don't really believe most of this stuff. And it wasn't out of some, high enlightened skepticism. It's just for whatever reason, it just never drew my attention. I've always kind of been a curious person. And the weirdest thing for me was I loved space when I was a kid. And especially when the pastors at church would say things that didn't jive with what I had learned about the heavenly bodies. Like, I think once one of the pastors said, the moon created its own light. And I'm like, that's not true. The moon reflects the sunlight. And I told him that, and he's like, no, that's not true. And I'm like, okay. So those kinds of things kind of just leave you to doubt things. But beyond that, I just grew up in that milieu, but I never really had any strong connections. It's not until about late middle school, eighth, ninth grade, that I began to have certain questions, simply because I looked things up online, not specifically theological questions, just I don't even know how that stuff came up, really. Well, I mean, I suppose it probably came up because I was always interested in scientific stuff, and those kind of questions eventually come up in those discussions on online forums and whatnot. So that's probably what ticked me off to certain things. And I actually I knew about Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, way back when, probably was it, eighth grade, maybe even as early as seventh grade. And it was one of those things that was on the back of my mind. And there was a point around 10th grade, and I was about 14, 15, about 14 at that time. And it just struck me. And so I read that book. It took me a while I decided I wanted to read it. It took me a while to get around to read it. And it was just things building up for doubts. And I finally read it. And despite the fact that, in the academic community, that book is completely trashed for proper reasons. It is not a theologically knowledgeable book. It is so full of misconceptions. Nonetheless, what Dawkins was attacking was a lay view of religion, which quite frankly is what most people do believe. And so when he rightfully attacked that and provided some pretty compelling arguments on that level, that was kind of the strong push for me to become aware that I just didn't really see what sense religion had, Christianity particularly, in my life or anybody's life. And so after reading that, I had a pretty typical reaction, the whole new atheism thing, militant atheism for a while. And eventually I just cooled off. I realized that getting into these rationalist arguments, whether they're factual or not, doesn't matter. Most people don't care. Most people, are put off by that. And you're not doing yourself any favors either, just making enemies for no reason. And you become a very unlikable person. A lot of what, makes new atheism a joke is that they come off as embittered, irrationally antagonistic people. And I didn't want to be that way. And, I realized, well, most people are just doing the best that they can. There's a certain point at which I realized that most people, that this whole idea of faith without reason, that people just believe for no reason whatsoever, is completely stupid. It's untrue. Obviously, people have reasons. They may not be completely rational reasons, but they have actual reasons. Nobody believes for no reason. That's a complete misunderstanding. So that understanding for me is what kind of led me to view religion more in a charitable light of a way in which people are trying to make sense of their reality. At some point there, it took about 2 years from my view of myself as an atheist to come to the standpoint in which even religious experiences were not something I was gonna just ignore. Most people go like, oh, well, you could just explain that away, right? And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. I'm like, well, I don't know what it is that they experienced. I can accept people experience some very strange things. I don't know what they are. Since I haven't experienced them, I couldn't say. But I could recognize that what a lot of people said about them because of the incoherence, both in their own accounts and in the accounts with other people. I at least recognized and thought, well, I may not know what it is, but it's very sure that they don't know either. And with that, eventually I ended up through various means I went to college, got into a bit of philosophy. I took a philosophy class in my second year, just out of curiosity and partly because I needed something to fill in my electives. And I'm like, okay, well, that seems interesting, though challenging. And in that whole process, I got into reading Marx, which, it's Marxists are atheists. So that certainly was not it was along the lines of my thought, materialism and whatnot. And actually had gotten into certain kinds of philosophical materialism and mechanism, particularly because of cosmology. But strangely, I did not find that to be ultimately in opposition to when I don't even remember how I got interested in mysticism. I just know it was connected to philosophy, the philosophy classes I was taking. It's not because it came up in the classes. Nothing anywhere near as interesting came up in the class. I have no idea how that ended up with that, but I did. And when I came up with that, I realized there are views of God that actually don't fall into the whole picture thinking of, the big man in the sky, who just is waiting to judge you and send you to hell for, any little thing just because, you don't accept some kind of doctrines from a religion and whatnot. So at first I got into, I particularly was interested in monism, stuff like Spinozism, even though I've never fully gotten into Spinoza. I want to eventually, but I got into the surface of particularly Eastern monisms like Advaita Vedanta, Hindu monisms, and they made sense. When you actually think about it, well, if God is everything, God is the highest being, sure, then it makes sense that one would think of the universe as one, a unity. It involves everything, involves everyone, and somehow you're part of it. And maybe there are states of mind in which, you could access some kind of intuitive truth regarding that. And surely that changes people's minds, and I think it does. not only on an intellectual level, but also at an experiential level, of course. And that was like my first entry into that, in which I became comfortable with the idea that, there was a concept of God which I was comfortable with, but which I recognized was not what most people thought of God when they said God. So, there was some kind of ground that I saw that where I could converse with typically religious people and have some conversations that were meaningful and fruitful. Even though fundamentally I thought we were in certain disagreements because of the way they viewed God and the way I viewed God. Eventually, though, because of my reading of Hegel, which has been a long, long time, I think now it's been about 7.5 years since I started my journey on that. And it took a long time because Hegel is also initially amenable to this view of God that isn't really the God of the regular people. And it's not until about 2 years, a year and a half ago, maybe, where I finally had this epiphany about the concept of personality, in which Hegel really makes it clear, I think, even though, yes, you're right, that most Hegelians nowadays are at least not openly theists. I have been informed by certain people who have taken classes with certain famous Hegelians that secretly they are. But they don't come out because they consider it bad PR.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the idea of personality is kind of what clinched it for me, as well as just a development of my understanding of the concept of freedom, or rather the idea of freedom, in which it doesn't make any sense that God would be this abstraction in relationship to us, that it's just the totality of this abstract totality, and that it itself does not have, or I don't even like saying it, I prefer they, and I said, and it's not because of like a non-gender thing. It's not like, oh, God is neither male or female. They implies a plurality. They implies both. It's a speculative term for me. We use it for individuals and we use it for pluralities. And so since God is the epitome of the concreteness of community, in the highest sense of the word, they is the fitting pronoun for God, in my opinion. So that understanding led me to the idea, well, God must have a personality themselves. It may not be like our own, and it certainly isn't like our own, but it is personality. And so God must be considered as an individuality themselves. And that's where, when I decided to write that blog about being comfortable now with terming myself a theist in the full sense. Because I don't consider, it's a funny thing even. Monism, particularly pantheism, is an atheist doctrine, ultimately. And it's funny that I never realized that before. Even there's one of the lectures that Richard Winfield has, completely unrelated to anything. And somewhere in the middle of that lecture, I think it's the lectures on technology from last year or a year prior. And he just mentions, oh, by the way, he's talking about something about just the view of the natural world. And he just goes, by the way, pantheism, and atheism are the same thing. And he says, every atheist is really just a pantheist in denial. They just don't know it because they just have a wrong notion of what God is. But, if they understood it, they just realize that where they fall on the theist spectrum is a pantheist, which is something interesting.
Yeah, that was very good. And I think you're right that the crucial difference really, I think that's what you're saying is, like, for you at least, the crucial difference between like this pantheist view, which is, as you were saying, is ultimately an atheism, or it is atheism, is this idea that for the theists, God must have some sort of personality. And as you were saying, it doesn't have to be like our personality. I mean, it probably isn't. But like as you were saying in your article, we are one of the self-determinations of God. I think that's your terminology. So is nature, but God as the logos, or as the idea, is outside of finitude and outside of space and time. And this would seem to contradict a very common Hegelian, like it calls itself Hegelian, or these people call themselves Hegelian. The Hegelian view that that God is the spiritual community, or God is the community united in some way. So how would you respond from a Hegelian perspective to these people who would identify God with the spiritual community as such, and not, as you would say, as the idea that has its own personality and is outside the boundaries of is beyond finitude and beyond space and time?
Well, the immediate response to that is that the very last lines of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences is literally, I don't have it on me, and I'm on my cell phone, so I'm not going to bring it up. I can't pull it up. But Hegel says something along the lines of literally the last sentence, that with the whole system being completed, we are left with an understanding that the idea, purified of its external appearances, which are merely appearances ultimately. You know, nature, even we, to a certain extent, are merely finite appearances. And that the idea for itself is pure knowledge, thinking itself. You know, it's Hegel even quotes Aristotle on this. And it's a very, very weird statement to make, because he says it's just not, he does say that it's independent self-knowing, just pure knowledge in and for itself. So that there is a sense in which we have nature, spirit, and the idea. And he even gives this example of 3 syllogisms of ways in which we can interpret the system as a whole. One in which it's idea, nature, and spirit sublates those. Then one of those is idea, spirit, and then nature sublates those. And then we have nature, spirit, and idea sublates those. And he particularly points out that 2 of those are incomplete, and the only proper one is the one where nature and spirit are sublated by the idea. So there's that. And the other more common sense argument I would give would be that the idea that we as human community are the completeness of God is obviously nonsense, because God can't be limited to this mere reflective understanding of itself. And Hegel even notes this in the passage I'm talking about. He notes that there is a finitude in the fact that for us, all we can do, all we have access to, is the retroactive reflection in which we can comprehend that, logically speaking, the entirety of the world is a presupposition of spirit. But we can't engage that positing ourselves. You know, our thoughts don't become immediately reality. You know, we have to mediate through labor, and we are limited by the capacities of our finite materiality. But God cannot. You know, God cannot have this limitation. It's impossible. You know, to put it in a technical sense, you know, God has intellectual intuition, whereas we do not. You know, for God, his thoughts, their thoughts, are the reality. You know, God thinks fire, and fire actually exists objectively. We think fire, and we just have an image in our heads. And if we want to actualize it, we have to go through the process of, you know, step by step making a fire. There's no problem like that for God. So that doesn't make sense that we would think that the absolute is limited to just merely this retroactive reflection. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah. And like one of the things you mentioned is that obviously the completeness of God is not the spiritual community. But I think probably like a Žižekian response to that would be an affirmation of this incompleteness, right? And then the affirmation that actually Hegel's system is in some way incomplete, and that it leaves open this incompleteness, and that this is actually the basis of freedom. So we can talk more about Žižek, maybe. Well, I guess this will probably lead into Žižek, but what I'm really interested in hearing your response on is how you can have this idea of God as the idea, and yet there still be freedom. Because I think one, if you go on YouTube and you look up these videos of Hegel, you either get the really, really bad one, which has this idea where Hegel has this like this system that where there is no freedom and it's just this devouring system. But then you also have one which I think you would say is also not accurate, where everything is just completely open, perhaps more in the Žižekian sense. But I think you would still say that, well, you do say in your article that freedom is still compatible with this idea of God, and with God who, in some senses, already determined the world to be as it is, and that the world is part of this self-determination of God. So how does freedom fit in with your theism?
So freedom fits in that, freedom is also synonymous with God. God is freedom itself. So part of this hinges on the understanding of the concrete universal, in which once you grasp what that is, that it's universal, particular, individual, and that these are three moments which are simultaneous always, and it's just three perspectives that we may flip around with. If God is freedom, let's put it this way, and freedom is the universal, it has to particularize itself, it has to individualize itself. But the relationship here is not a relationship of essence, for example, which is the way that we and the understanding generally think. We think in essences. We think of determinations of this causes that, this conditions that. But the concept does not work that way. The concepts of subjectivity, freedom, God cannot work that way. So in determining itself, this is not a causal relationship. It's not something forcing itself on something else. It is simply the self-developing expression of that. So if God is free and God is self-knowing and God's knowledge is being, because God has intellectual intuition, the first step of the free being, which knows itself as free, is to have another free being before it. Because if what is before it is itself not as free as itself, then it could not know its freedom. Its freedom is not its own object. Therefore, the idea that God creates a world and creates it with a purpose, and that purpose is freedom itself, makes complete sense. This is not, it cannot be deterministic. There may be indeed final purposes, and there clearly are, but they're not formal. And that's the neat thing about it. It's not, you can have deterministic relationships which are not formal in any normal way. So that, we have this world in which nature for its own part is free to the extent that it is free. Matter isn't given its laws by God. It's not that, God, there's matter and then God has to give it the law of gravity. No, gravity is immanent to what matter is. It's just part of its own determination as what it is. God doesn't have to give biological organisms the law of needing to eat or all these things. It's just immanent to what they are. It's the way in which they self-develop. Likewise, we don't have to be given the law of freedom, because we are it. And the way freedom develops freely is necessarily a bit chaotic, because we are born in ignorance. We must, at least in the temporal realm, be born in ignorance. We are forced to make mistakes. There's no way to avoid it. And we have conflicts with each other precisely because we are ignorant, precisely because we have to come to our own mediation, because God cannot come down and just say, hey, here's the right way to live, here's the right things to do. Because as we see, even if we take for granted, that perhaps this happened long ago, in biblical times, clearly people didn't agree. So, God coming down doesn't even help anything ultimately, because we still have to agree to this and know this for ourselves. So there's a long struggle necessarily for all of this. So this totality of freedom requires this necessary contingency, a contingency which has this ultimate end of becoming free, in which this very process of becoming free is itself free. it's in the natural sphere, there are no guarantees as far as we can tell. As far as there being divine interventions, we don't know. We have legends of that, but okay. But supposing that it is the case or is not the case, either way, from our perspective, we can't hold on to this idea that, we're going to hope that God comes down and saves us, before we launch nukes from ourselves. It's all on us to a certain extent. And at the same time, it's just the way that freedom develops. And whatever happens is part of the education process of humanity as a whole. And this does not require some ultimate break, an ultimate openness. This is where I disagree with Žižek, that somehow we have to interpret this as, well, ultimately it's just a contradiction, and the truth we find out is that everything falls apart in the end. Not necessarily, not in the way, finitely sure. But there's a way in which they don't. And for example, Hegel doesn't focus on this world ultimately. There's a reason why the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences does not end with objective spirit, because objective spirit is the objective social state in the world we live in. And Hegel makes it clear that he doesn't think that's where the ultimate resolutions of reality lie. He seems to think that there will always be states. States will come and go. Peoples will come and go. Cultures will come and go. And that's not where you see the final unity of everything. And it's not the case that Hegel thinks that there's ever going to be a time in the future, or there ever was a time in the past where we had this ultimate unity. If God is real, and God is definitely the one that is eternal and posits the entirety of space and time and all of us, then God is accessible at all times, and God is actual at all times. There is no point in which God is any more or less. The difference is, perhaps in our ability to access that to a certain extent. And this is what absolute spirit is about. Absolute spirit is about accessing God here and now. First through art, the representations of art, beauty, then through religion, and then finally through philosophy. And in philosophy for Hegel, as he says in a few places, that he doesn't consider that philosophy and religion have any different content. Their content is the idea. They just express in different ways. Now, he doesn't think that they're equal expressions, certainly. He thinks that philosophy is indeed higher than religion, but only in the sense that one could say that philosophy is religion purified of its mystique in the way of this mythological character, this story narrative character, and just purified into the pure concepts and structures of what is really imminent to all of that. And in that way, you're not caught up in the whole thing of, am I a Buddhist? Am I a Christian? Am I a Hindu? Am I in any of these religions? Because you recognize from the standpoint of philosophy, they all hold a certain truth that is validated by the knowledge of what God really is.
Right. Yeah. And I like how you mentioned how for Žižek, it's sort of like, or like when you focus on the spiritual community, for example, like that is only, as you mentioned, like objective spirit is one moment in the encyclopedia. And I think you, in your Reddit post in the Hegel Reddit, where you were sort of critiquing Žižek and Todd McGowan, you mentioned how a big problem with a lot of the interpretations of Hegel is that they sort of take one moment in the system, and then they focus on one of this moments, and they act like this is a key to everything. And actually, I was pretty recently, I was sort of like, I was sort of thinking that Žižek, when he talks about the subject, and like for him as a Lacanian, right, he has this idea of the barred subject, which he equates with Hegel's understanding. He does so pretty explicitly in the preface to the Sublime Object. And I don't really see how Žižek gets out of the understanding. And that's pretty early on in the phenomenology, but I just don't see how he does that. And I think that's I think what lends credence to this, to my idea here, is the fact that his understanding of absolute knowing is he has different expressions of it, but it's basically the reconciliation with the impossibility of moving beyond the understanding. Like he even says that reason is not moving beyond the understanding in an actual positive sense. It's only sort of a reconciliation with the inner antagonism of the understanding, which for him, for Žižek, is this limitation of subjectivity. So actually, I have a quote right here. It's only one sentence from Less Than Nothing, where Žižek says, absolute knowing is a name for the acceptance of the absolute limitation of the circle of our subjectivity, of the impossibility of stepping outside of it. Now, Todd McGowan has a similar view of this, which I honestly, I've talked to Todd about this, and basically I think that he agrees with me that basically him and Žižek are saying the exact same thing. But so Todd says, in the phenomenology, absolute knowing is the recognition that one can never overcome contradiction because contradiction lies within being itself, that it is not just the subject's own failure, but a failure of being. So in both cases, you see that for Žižek and for Todd, the absolute for them is, or the absolute is, well, for Todd, contradiction, for Žižek, it's finitude or antagonism, and the absolute knowing or overcoming, well, which is not language they would accept, but sort of attaining absolute knowing is just reconciliation with the necessity of contradiction or antagonism. So how would you respond to this view of the absolute, and why, in your opinion, is it not being properly faithful to Hegel himself?
So let me start out with contradiction. The view that contradiction cannot be overcome is the strangest thing to me, especially because I know Todd McGowan likes to use the Mobius strip, which is a very good example for dialectics. A Mobius strip is contradictory in that, it's visually speaking and spatially speaking, it appears to us as an object that has two sides, it has a top side, bottom side. But when you actually trace it on the surface, the two sides are actually one side. For the understanding, this is completely nonsense. Nonetheless, you can actually look at a Mobius strip and you can understand perfectly well why this happens. So for the understanding, the contradictions are always unintelligible. This is the difference between understanding and reason. The understanding just cannot grasp, how is it that being and nothing could possibly be the same? It's impossible. It's either one or the other. Either being is being and nothing, or there's only nothing or there's only being, but you can't have, a being that is nothing or nothing that is being, and you definitely can't identify both. To the understanding, this does not make sense. It short circuits its thought process. It literally cannot make sense of this, so it is unintelligible to it. For reason, this is no problem. Why? Because we can look at the thought process, understand perfectly well why it is produced. Just in the same way as when you might be mystified by the fact that the Mobius strip actually only has one side, technically speaking, topologically. But just trace the path through it, and you can see exactly how it happens. And it is perfectly intelligible why it happens. Of course, when you try to frame it in these static categories of, it's only either top side or bottom side, it doesn't make sense. But, on the level of reason, you see how they move to each other. So it's not nonsense. The way you overcome contradiction is you understand how it happens and you realize that it's not nonsense at all. It is oppositional, yes, but it's oppositional only in a certain moment, which is the difference. To accept contradiction for reason can accept it because reason can see exactly how it is produced, and reason has produced it itself. With being and nothing, for example, why is being nothing? Well, because it has no determinations. It is absolutely empty. We try to think it and we can't. And we have a name for that incapacity, or which, you might want to initially say, oh, it's my incapacity. No, Hegel's whole thing is we can't distinguish here between my thinking and the thing itself. So in the incapacity to find anything within being that is, I have the intuition of nothing, and I'm saying intuition here only in a general sense, not in a technical sense. Obviously, it's not a sense intuition, and I would want to call it intellectual intuition, but technically speaking, that's probably going a bit too far. But we have this sense. So, and then when you have the sense of, okay, there's nothing, it's a whole bunch of nothing, but now I have the nothing before me as an object, and the form strikes me. And you say, well, but the nothing is. So it is what it is. So it's being. And you have this back and forth, and you realize, well, we have this immediate thing, which in being immediate has nothing within it, has nothing outside. It cannot be defined. But that which is undefined, which has no presence at all, is precisely nothing. But nothing is present. Now, how is it present? I can't say at that point in logic, but I know it is present because its immediacy strikes me. And that's exactly what being is. So you have that. And then when you realize that, oh, you have this whole circuit now is becoming, and why? Because becoming is this concept that we have for like both, which both is and is not at once. And you move on, you move on, you move on. There's nothing unintelligible about that, ultimately. For most people that I've encountered, at least that seek me out trying to understand this is something that makes sense to them. And they're very surprised because they've heard that a lot of this is just nonsense. Of course, you try to read it with no background with yourself, or you don't have any experience in reading philosophical texts. It certainly probably strikes you as nonsense. But there's a very intuitive aspect to it in which, just like a Mobius strip, if you could just look at it and follow the train of thought, it will make sense. Even though once you try to put it together in regular terms, it's impossible basically to say it. And Hegel says this in a few places in the Phenomenology and as well as Science of Logic about the speculative proposition, where in order to say a speculative truth, like what being is or nothing is, or really what becoming is, you have to say it in two sentences, being, or even as it's almost four, because you have to affirm that being is being, because there is the moment of being. You have to assert that nothing is nothing. You have to assert that they are each other. And then you have to assert a third of which they are each other while not being each other. And so in propositional form, this is just a giant mess, which is why, people ask for what's Hegel's definition of this thing? I can't do it. I'm going to have to tell you yes and no. People ask, what's the Hegelian answer to this? I'm like, well, it's a yes and a no, as always. And it has to be explicated specifically in the way the concept moves. So that's the thing about contradiction. I just disagree with them about the nature of contradiction and its status on that completely. So for reason to be they're right that reason is the acceptance of contradiction, but it's the acceptance not based on a acceptance of an inability, which is what the understanding does. It's the acceptance of, I have seen with my own intellectual eyes what the thing actually does. I have followed its movements, and I know why this happens. And I know that immanently, this makes sense. Externally, yes, I then say being is nothing, and it sounds like complete nonsense. But once I explain it to you, it makes complete sense. And it's this acceptance that the whole circuit is valid. Once you have being nothing, being nothing, being nothing, once you have that, you're in this closed circuit and you realize there's nowhere else to go. So this thing must be a self-constituting totality. That's what reason is. When reason recognizes the contradiction is a self-constituting totality, the universal, and that we can make intelligible exactly why it is and how it is. That's the acceptance of contradiction. And this leads to so many things just cascading. If you're not, if you want to race ahead, you can immediately start seeing things about the explication of the concept and all these other things. So there's that. Now, regarding absolute knowing, I also disagree with them on this completely. This has to be the strangest reading of them all. And I've seen a few people who don't quite agree with Žižek, but at least agree on this. And it seems to me that this stems a lot from Adorno's view of dialectics, negative dialectics. And this idea, for example, Jay Bernstein also has this view in which he says absolute knowing, the phenomenology of spirit, is the acceptance that in the end, knowledge is impossible. There's someone else whose lectures I've also linked to, and that was also their conclusion. It was the strangest thing to me. Their conclusion is a very skeptical one, that it's the Absolute knowing is just the knowing that knowledge is impossible. Let me move over to the sun a little bit.
Sure.
And that could not be further from the truth. There's actually a post I made on my blog explaining this, that absolute knowing is called absolute knowing for a reason. You know, when Hegel uses certain phrases, they're very technically used. Anything absolutely self-referential. Why is absolute knowing absolute? Well, because what it knows is knowing. And you have to realize, you know, this whole idea, you know, the whole thing about the recollection of the spirits and whatnot, this isn't just happening at the end. It's happened from the very beginning. Since the very beginning, since sense certainty, the only way movement has ever been possible is that consciousness can stand back and look upon itself and recognize, oh, this is going on. Sure, you know, as far as the finite spirits go, you know, sense certainty, perception, force and understanding, self-consciousness, all these things, they don't have to necessarily ever become aware of this themselves. You know, it's like any process of learning. Some people will be able to learn from themselves, and sometimes it's other people who learn from other people's mistakes. So in our case, in the phenomenology, Hegel never places it that the consciousness themselves ever realizes, you know, because they are what they are, and because they are bound within their own horizon as that. So sense certainty, if it is sense certain, and we don't think, you know, we presume that this is always a human subject, doesn't have to necessarily be the case. You know, sense certainty could be an animal consciousness, for example. So can perception, so can even understanding, by the way. People don't think about this. Animals sense, perceive, and understand. You know, the fact that you can actually have a dog or a pet and teach it something is because it has a measure of causal essential understanding. It does understand. It doesn't understand understanding itself, of course. You know, animals don't have the concept of cause in their repertoire of, you know, intellectual objects in their mind, but they operate under this, and that's the only thing necessary to have in order to engage that kind of thinking. So with sense certainty, the way we find out the next move is precisely to stand back and look at sense certainty. And that's an instance of knowing. In perception, again, we have to stand back at the end and look at what perception has been doing. And that's another instance of knowing. And then understand the same thing. The movement to self-consciousness is yet another stance of knowing again. We don't know this explicitly until the very end, where we know. We have always known absolutely. It's not the case that you only achieve absolute knowing at the last chapter of the Phenomenology Spirit. That's not the case at all. You've always known absolutely. If you didn't, none of the phenomenology would ever be possible.
Right. Yeah, it's always been, or since I started reading Hegel, it's been confusing to me how Žižek could interpret absolute knowing as this impossibility of knowing. Like, because that seems to be the essence of Hegel. It's this becoming for itself of the in itself. But for Žižek, for him, absolute knowing is when you reconcile with a fundamental impossibility of knowing, of transcendence. And this is a very Lacanian idea, because like it's based on Lacan's formula or phrase that there is no meta language. So for Lacan, there is no point. Well, in the context of the subject, there's no way the subject can jump on its own shoulders and then see itself. And like in the context of the Mobius strip, I think perhaps what sort of Žižekian response would be is that what you're saying about this sort of transcendence of the contradiction, this looking at it objectively, this is sort of trying to take a meta language position that Žižek pretty clearly prohibits. He considers that impossible. And I think sort of the way to conceptualize this is by understanding Žižek's emphasis on immanence, and how from within the immanent perspective, like from the subject's perspective, the subject is here, right? It has its perspective, but it cannot know about its own perspective. Like that would constitute this as I said, like the jumping on its own shoulders. That's an example Žižek uses of like this impossibility of escaping the correlational circle, or whatever you want to call it, the transcendental horizon. So I think for Žižek, the point that he would want to emphasize is that there is no meta language, and this relates to his understanding of Christ and his atheist Christianity, because the way Žižek interprets the death of Christ, which he calls the Hegelian reading, he says that Christ is this moment where, of course, substance becomes subject, but more, I think even more importantly for Žižek, it's that substance itself is revealed, or the big other, to use Lacanian terminology, the big other is the transcendent, is revealed as internally self-contradictory. So if the transcendence itself, the transcendent being God himself, isn't free from contradiction and self-division, then there is no possibility at all of escaping contradiction. So that's Žižek's and McGowan's reading. So I was wondering, maybe you could go into your interpretation of Christ and the meaning of Christ within Hegel's system in general, and in terms of the history of spirit, and how this would relate to Žižek's view that there is no being like God for Žižek, free from contradiction or free from self-division. I'm just wondering how you would read this, and if you disagree, which I'm assuming you do, how you would critique this from a Hegelian point of view.
Well, in the way you phrased it, I actually don't disagree that much. I would just disagree in that little final thing about what does this contradiction ultimately mean? You know, for Žižek, this is just a fragmentation in the end. For me, the way Žižek and McGowan frame this is just a misunderstanding. Because of what the universal is, you know, the universal always must be particular individual. Therefore, it involves distinctions necessarily. And it must involve distinctions, because if there were no distinctions, it wouldn't be a universal anyway. You know, if you don't have any distinctions, what is it universal to? Well, nothing. It's not even a universal at that point. So the fact that a contradiction must be immanent, yes, of course. But then again, as we've already discussed, that a contradiction is no problem in the end. It's not some kind of negative, destructive division. I mean, in a way, to jump to something related, it's very Taoist, you know, and the yin and yang, you know, the unity of opposites in that way. The only thing, you know, some people bring this up a lot when they first encounter Hegel, like, oh, you know, like, is Hegel like, you know, did Hegel read the Chinese Taoists? Because like it's very, very similar. Yes, superficially similar in that, you know, the case for the unity of opposites is a true one. The only difference is that Hegel can actually explain it, whereas the Taoists don't. And for Hegel, the contradiction, this unity of opposites, the very distinction, the very contradiction itself is its own resolution. Which I think, you know, at least superficially, McGowan and Žižek and I agree with. It's just what does this mean that we disagree on? That in Jesus dying on the cross, if I recall correctly, because I'm not really that familiar with this section. Part of its meaning is that this is the death. It's a death of the transcendent God, yes, but it's also the death of the finite man as finite man, and the revelation that nonetheless God lives on in spirit, in community, proves indeed the transcendent character of God. Not transcendent in a radical way, but transcendent immanently, in which the infinite is within the finite here and now. It's not something else awaiting us from beyond. That indeed our own separation is the very thing which allows for spirit to exist. You know, if we weren't different people, we couldn't have community. If there wasn't a world, in the sense that we conceive it on a finite, on our perspective, there couldn't be God, because God then wouldn't have an object for themselves to see and behold their own freedom. So in that sense, the purely intellectual God, which is what Hegel calls just a merely logical idea, is indeed not God. When we speak of the idea, there has to be a distinction here between the merely logical idea, which is merely logic for us, and the actual idea, which is to be understood as the infinite reality, which includes both logic and nature and spirit. Where logic is no longer understood as a merely conceptual thing, but as an ideal thing. It is the thing immanent in everything. So for me, the death of Christ is not a proof that that there is no radical transcendence. The God dies on the cross. The abstract God dies on the cross, but God doesn't die. Indeed, death is necessary to prove that God is beyond the limitations of finitude. If we didn't have that moment where Jesus dies and resurrects, we wouldn't really properly know that God is God and what God truly is.
Nice. Yeah, that was, I think that sort of helps to clarify the difference between your reading of Hegel and Žižek's, which I think you even said this in your Reddit post. A lot of it has to do with Žižek's Lacanianism and how I think Lacan, I know Žižek sort of, even Žižek says this. I don't think Žižek would really disagree with this, because in Less Than Nothing, he does try to outline certain ways in which Lacan, by taking into account Lacan's insights, you can certain limitations, Hegel, Žižek would say, certain limitations of Hegel are revealed. So yeah, that was very good. Now I guess the last thing I sort of want to talk about is how to read Hegel, because I think this is very important, and it's something that you have talked about a lot, and it's something that I sort of needed to hear before I went and read Hegel, because there's very few people who talk about how to read Hegel, because Hegel is a very, for one, he's pretty difficult, especially if you're new to philosophy and you're unfamiliar with philosophical terms. But even if you are familiar with philosophy, Hegel thinks, and he thinks through ideas very uniquely and different than probably every other philosopher that has ever written. And something you say is that attempts to formalize Hegel, that is to create certain formulas wherein you can understand, like certain abstract formulas that would act as like containers, wherein you could take Hegel's ideas and then put it through the formula, and then there you get the answer. This is something that really doesn't work. And you contrast these formalisms with what you call the speculative syllogism. So I'm wondering if you could go into this, what you mean by the speculative syllogism and how it's opposed to formulas, and why specifically formulas of, for example, the dialectic fail. I know you have a video series on why dialectical formulas fail.
Yeah, that's a $1 million question. How to read this guy. I think I am in a unique situation where I'm lucky that I've had the trajectory I've had, because in a way I've been crazy with it, and I haven't had the weight of academic necessities, of time pressures, and having to actually formulate things in a certain way for a class, where I've been allowed to just take my time with the text and do what one ideally should do with any philosophical text, which is it's not a race to find the right answer. that's not really it. You know, the proper way to engage philosophy generally is you want to make sense of something, and you're trying to engage in dialogue with the person you're reading. So, you know, a lot of it is quite speculative in the sense that speculation in its original, you know, this is the etymology of it is means just to see, to observe. So, you know, when we speak of a speculative method in Hegel, it sounds weird, except, you know, this is it's always contradictory. I love it. You'd think that speculation would be the ultimate aim of everyone today, because everybody believes that they can be, to some extent, objective. Even the people who deny objectivity think that they have some kind of objective insight into the universal subjectivity of everything, which is funny. So a lot of what Hegelian philosophy involves is just removing yourself as an intermediary, removing your assumptions of things, and taking things for what they are. Of course, this necessarily has problems, because there are ways to do this wrong. You know, if you don't, if you begin in the middle without questioning a lot of presuppositions, you'll just sneak in those presuppositions anyway, which is why, you know, it is, well, for example, I tell people that they don't have to really begin with the science of logic. And indeed, you don't have to. If you're going to read Hegel, like once you understand how to read it, it's all good. You can go ahead and read anything else, so long as you keep in the back of your mind that what you don't know, you don't know. You know, just pay attention to what's actually going on that is intelligible. And if you can follow that, you're safe. But don't sneak anything in behind it. The way to read Hegel is, initially, I took it as sort of word riddles, word puzzles. You know, from the beginning of Science of Logic, for example, he says, you know, if you try to think being, there's nothing there. You know, you can't think. You know, in the fact that when you try to penetrate into this thing, which is immediate and undefined, and obviously you find nothing, well, then it is nothing. And it's somewhat comical in a way. The same thing with nothing. You know, the moment you think nothing, well, it is. That's one way to see it. And funny enough, that was very helpful to me initially for about the first week. And then I managed to move beyond that, in which I paid attention that the reason, you know, word riddles can even make sense is because there's meaning to them. And the question is, what is the meaning of this? And that's ultimately what it all devolves into. That you cannot formalize it precisely because this is entirely about meaning. The way to think about being and nothing has nothing to do with understanding some kind of formalism. It won't help. And there are many people who I've encountered who are very intelligent, I think, and who are very clever. And they manifest the appearance, and they can talk about this at a very high level of understanding this. But the way you catch who does and who does not understand is who can actually explain to you in basic terms without using a lot of jargon about what is going on. You know, what is going on with being and nothing? And somebody will go, oh, but you know, there's the universal and the particular, and the individual does this. And they give you a formulation as to why things are happening a certain way. But you don't even need to do that. All you need to do with being and nothing, well, being is the immediate, you know, Hegel says. It's the absolute immediate. It's so immediate that if you called it immediacy, it would be wrong, because immediate is, you know, not mediate, which is already a mediated phrase. And he says, we don't want to do that. So, you know, there's a cleverness there. So there's being. And he says, well, now think the immediate immediately. Well, here's an unrelated thing, which I'm supposed to unrelatedly think, but thinking is relationship. So I try to think this, which is unrelated, think it unrelatedly, and what do I find? I can't think. But this has itself produced a relationship. It's a relationship of the non-being. And this is its meaning. You know, the meaning of the immediate is no meaning, but that itself is a new meaning. And so then I take this and I recognize, oh, this is a new meaning. You know, and we might say that, you know, Hegel says that every moment of the science of logic is just a moment of the a version of the absolute. You know, we're taking these definitions of the absolute. So, you know, we thought first being is the absolute. It's like, you know, it just, everything is. And then we realize, well, no, actually, no, everything is not. And then we realize, wait, no, actually, if it is not, it is, because what is not. And the meaning of that is precisely just that activity of these moments of cognition, at least conceptually speaking, of the logic. If we want to think about it objectively, if we want to speak of just being as if it was a thing, it also relies on its meanings. If there's a thing that is unarticulated, a thing with no distinctions, it's a whole bunch of nothing. But if you can, even if you have an emptiness before you, that emptiness, that nothingness is for you. And that's just what it is to be intelligible. This is part of the relationship of being and thinking, that if a thing is, in order for a thing to be intelligible as a spatial thing, it would have to appear spatial. You can tell that a thing is three-dimensional because it appears three-dimensional. If it didn't, you wouldn't be able to describe it three-dimensionally anyways. You can think that you can tell that a thing has an essence because it manifests the structures of essence. If it didn't, you wouldn't even be thinking of an essence for it anyways. You would just think, oh, well, things are just what they are. But they mean the moment you can penetrate behind the appearance and you realize that, you walked towards a mirage in the desert and it vanishes and you're like, oh, this thing that was actually is not. And then if you have some kind of causal relationship that you have at hand, you can start seeing, oh, it's actually just water vapor, due to the heat and all these other things. It's not very complicated. And in fact, I think that it's just what mystifies, the whole formulation thing mystifies things for too many people. They're trying to catch, like, where's the formula here? What step in the formula? When what you're supposed to be doing is just think about it. Just literally look at it. Take your time. And I think a lot of people just feel despair because initially, yes, particularly with this stuff like the science of logic, phenomenology, spirit, the beginning, this stuff just does not seem to have anything to do with what people want to know. You read the blurbs of that phenomenology spirit, and it sounds like this odyssey of mind and self-consciousness. And you start the first chapter, and it's about this epistemological stuff about sense certainty. And you're like, what the heck does that have to do with it? So that kind of stuff, the abstractness of it initially, I think, trips people up, and they want to get to the meat of it. And reformulations seem to take us from the end and try to organize things already in a way that we want to make things make sense. And that's exactly what you're not supposed to do. Unfortunately for most people, and Hegel even says this, he says, don't think that philosophy is here to edify you. It's not that it won't. It's just that you can't presuppose that it will or that it should. In a way, this is precisely what a lot of people hate about the perception of philosophy, which is like, oh, philosophy is this disinterested thing, for people who are just observing the world from an ivory tower, as if they're not part of it. And initially, indeed, that's exactly what you have to do, because, both in philosophical science and in empirical science, if you go in with a presupposed end, you're likely to draw out precisely what you want to see. And you'll ignore all the things that go against what you want to see, and you'll be biased. So in a way, the whole presupposition that philosophy ought to do anything, like Marxists, like even Žižek, I would say, falls into this precisely because of his Marxist leanings. That somehow there's some kind of thing that philosophy is supposed to do. Even with Lacan, though Lacan does not fashion himself a philosopher, I do think Lacan is actually a philosopher of mind, and a very good one, in which. Part of this idea is, well, you're supposed to do this kind of philosophy of mind as a sort of therapy, as sort of, a therapy for the subject. And those kinds of things just get in the way. I think that one of the things that people don't recognize is that Hegelian philosophy is not for what they might think it is, precisely because they come in for ulterior reasons. Like Marxists, for example, always think like, oh, we got to think dialectically. For what? We have to think about dialectically because of, we need to run our organizations properly. It has nothing to do with running organizations properly. I mean, organizational issues are not like these logical problems. Yeah, it's not about like, oh, I got the right form of the organization. Now we're going to run things perfectly. There are people in your organizations. There are problems specific to your organization, which are going to be hashed out in dialogue. I mean, that's the real dialectic, literally. It's dialogue between people. It's dialogue between free agents in which we have to hash things out. That's part of the incompleteness, which is complete. If we can realize such things, we are engaging in the logical process of the self-constitution of reality as a totality, a self-realizing totality. Another thing with Hegel is, okay, so, we have to start with these very bizarre, seemingly unrelated things to our everyday lives, like logic or epistemology and phenomenology of spirit. A lot of that it's like mathematics to me. Just as most people just aren't into math because it seems disconnected from reality for a lot of things. You have to build up these skills. You have to build up these concepts, which immediately don't seem fancy, don't seem like they will accomplish much of anything. And indeed, initially when I engaged this stuff, it just seemed like a self-contained thing, where it was something that I enjoyed as a curious little bit of reasoning and logic. And I didn't know what it had in connection with reality. And eventually, it just takes over your brain somehow. And it's not that you're projecting things on the world. Initially, at first, it's like, oh, here's this moment of the logic, and here's that moment of logic here happening. A lot of it eventually becomes you start thinking with this unconsciously. It's amazing. It's amazing because you start encountering information and you start being able to just spontaneously synthesize it into relationships of, putting things into an order that is imminently self-resolving. I think that the best example for this to me, which I'm astounded that people don't do this, ecology is probably the best way to introduce dialectical thinking or speculative thinking more properly, because ecology is already a holistic science in which ecosystems are all, you can specify ecosystems both as totalities, and within these totalities, specify how each part is constituted in the totality and maintains the totality. You have the carbon cycle, water cycles, soils, developments, fauna, flora, and how all those interrelate. And you have cycles of cycles within cycles of cycles, and it's one giant cycle we call the ecosystem, the biosphere, you might say, the totality of the planet. And that's what dialectical thinking, so-called, actually looks like in the end. And if you look at it that way, something like what Todd McGowan and Žižek say about the ultimate falling apart of everything doesn't make any sense with that kind of example at all, because we do see ecosystems as these totalities, which are indeed not absolute totalities, but which for a large part of the time of our own existence on the earth as individuals are these self-generative totalities which respond and react to everything going on within them and self-develop in that way.
Excellent. Yeah. I just want to say for anyone watching that if you want the full overview of your introduction to reading Hegel, it's on your channel. So I highly suggest everyone go watch that, because as I mentioned, for me, having to if I didn't have Antonio's videos and also some other people's videos to sort of guide me through Hegel, I don't think I would have been able to. I think I probably would have given up. That's probably what I would have done. And I think a lot of people do give up on Hegel. And it sort of is a shame, because he definitely is one of the most interesting and unique philosophers. And while I can't say that I have not gotten into Hegel the way you have, and the way you describe it with his way of thinking sort of becoming your way of thinking. That I can't say that's happened to me yet, but I certainly believe it, and yeah, and that's why I've always found Hegel very fascinating. But with that, I don't want to take any more of your time, and I think we've pretty much gone to everything or touched on everything I wanted to talk about with you. So, do you have any final things you want to mention? And if not, you could just mention where we can, or where the viewers can find you online, and maybe what you're up to in the near future.
All right. There's something else I would like to discuss, so I'll get into it right now.
Sure.
I'll mention some of the things that I'm working on. So currently I'm working on a project, and if anybody watching is interested, please reach out to me. It's a Hegelian encyclopedia, a Hegel wiki of sorts. I've been posting about it a little bit on my Twitter. Work has been pretty intense, and so my ability to expand on that. And I'm basically right now the one who's writing like 99% of it. Luckily, most of it is already done because I'm basically just rewriting a lot of my blogs and cleaning them up and making them a bit more academically and self-related to other articles. And it's supposed to be my explicit presentation of an introduction to Hegelianism in general, where I'm trying to hit all the core points of what people who are brand new want to know at a level in which, and I've always presented this about my project, which is, this is not an introduction in which it's going to make sense to everybody. I understand that there are people who just want a very, very superficial grasp, which to me is fine. Okay, I don't hold it against anybody for that. But to me, it's I'm trying to get a presentation of Hegel so that people can read him themselves. That is the most important thing for me, like getting the method down. And whether people eventually, buy into the method, whether they believe that it is all that it's cracked up to be or not, doesn't so much matter to me as so much as people have the access to what I consider to be the key. And the key is not a concept, it's the key is just learning. It's a way that's not just to read Hegel in the end. It's a way to read everybody. Because for example, the way that Hegel being like my second actual serious philosophical independent endeavor, the first being Marx, helped me immensely with learning to be patient and charitable with philosophy in general. So that for example, when I first read Hegel, I then read some Schelling. I thought Schelling was really bad. And it's not until a couple of years later that I had this experience that then I went back to Schelling and having the patience of being able to follow a text and pay attention in the way that I paid attention to Hegel. That Schelling made a lot more sense, and I could appreciate it in a way that I could not before in my impatience to try to get something more immediate. So I'm working on that. If you want to check that out, I posted about it on Reddit. The website is not live. It won't be live until it's ready, but I'm thinking that there'll probably be somewhere around 60 articles. And some of them are very long, very detailed. And I don't know everything about Hegel, but I'm trying to get the basics of the introductions to pretty much all of the general areas. So, everything like the concept of freedom, just generally the concept of God, the concepts, the method, and all these other things. So that's the major project that I'm working on. So anybody who's interested, who knows about Hegel and wants to share their knowledge, I can't offer you any money. Nobody's giving me any money. But hey, if you want recognition, if you want to help the understanding of Hegel universally, you may become part of this project and I would welcome it. Another thing is, lately I've been, if you paid attention to my channel, I've been working on some aesthetics stuff. Actually, in the last couple of years, I've been less focused on Hegel himself than working on just thinking about aesthetics generally, jumping off from Hegel, but not directly following him, because I find it a very useful thing for me to think about something for myself before I go and see, what does Hegel say about this? It exercises my mind, and it keeps me fresh in being able to think about things for myself, see how things make sense to me, and then go and see what other people say. This is, I suppose, a difference that's not necessarily better. It's just different, and I think it's something that comes with intellectual maturity to an extent in which you gain both the skill, but also the the self-confidence to do this yourself. You know, you can't just go from nothing and do this. You can't just go like, oh, well, I'll read, you know, I'm just starting out. I read Plato, you know, one of the dialogues, and, you know, now I'm going to go ruminate about ethics as such for myself without any background. You know, because a lot of those things at the very beginning, because you don't have any, you don't have this great cultural background, you're going to end up being all over the place with a lot of just ultimately worthless thoughts that you could have just spared yourself had you read somebody else who just says like, by the way, you know, this thing you thought immediately is pretty wrong, and here's why. So that kind of stuff helps. But I've been working on aesthetics, and it fascinates me because before Hegel, I did not care about art at all. You know, to me, art was just this thing of like, well, yeah, you like it, and it's fun and cool, but it wasn't anything deep. You know, and I kind of always, when I had taken art classes and art appreciation classes, the whole idea of art analysis struck me as like such a weird and nonsensical thing, because at least the way I had encountered it was people saying the most obvious things, and things which to me were just like, well, you're just projecting. It has nothing to do with this piece. And you're like, you know, the text says this, and that's what it is. But after Hegel, after just engaging the thinking of what is beauty, according to Hegel. Hegel says beauty is just the idea in sensuous form. And thinking about that from what I comprehend generally about the methodology, I drew out a lot of things which in the aftermath, once I drew them out, helped me look upon art in a whole different light, which is not merely an intellectual appreciation, but I really see things in art now. You know, for example, the last thing that I've done recently, literally finished this week, is I read the entirety of The Trial and made a commentary on it. Franz Kafka's The Trial. And boy, that is eye-opening. It's not simply, and it's not because I applied Hegelian dialectics to this story, by the way. It's just an art analysis in the same way that most people do art analysis, which is you know, seeing what is intelligible in there, what are the deeper meanings. But the idea of looking at things in the mode of meaning as truth, of looking at the relationship between an appearance and what it signifies, is immensely powerful. You know, you talk to Chad Haig, and I take this from Chad Haig, who I think takes it from Žižek, in which he has one of his favorite examples for aesthetics is, and it's not even aesthetics, he talks about just general meaning. He says that, you know, strength, for example, like the meaning, the way that a concept manifests, you know, if in the concept of strength, you know, when you see muscles, muscles do not represent strength. They are what strength looks like. You know, that's one thing about aesthetics. So in a certain way, when you look at an artwork and you're going to interpret it, an interpretation that is really a good one is always going to be inherently philosophical, whether that person knows it or not. With a trial, for example, there are so many things in which, if you're not thinking this way, it just does not stand out to you that there is any great relationship between the way Kafka describes things and what the meaning of the book is. It's striking, and I mean this really, and it's striking that it's as pervasive as it is, how a lot of artists, and I do believe this is intuitive more than conscious in a lot of ways, have an incredible unity of meaning to their artworks. When you examine the details, some of them are ridiculous, like they're ridiculously detailed. One of the most amazing ones that I've seen is there's, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Synecdoche, New York. It's a very good movie. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's very philosophical explicitly. It's almost postmodern, I think. It's probably one of the most postmodern movies, very meta, very entertaining too. And somebody made a series of analysis videos about this movie, just going over the details and how they relate to the themes. And I think it's gone up to like 8 hours of analysis of this like 2-hour movie, and they're not even halfway after like 6 years or so. And the most strange things that you wouldn't even imagine have connection to the meaning can be drawn into connection with the central themes very strongly. Particularly with my analysis of the trial, for example. I'll bring this up because I find it interesting. Todd McGowan uploaded an analysis of the trial himself to about 2 months ago to his channel. I listened to it, and boy, it's like we read a completely different book. And I have to say that in some ways, I was disappointed because there's a certain way in which, because Todd McGowan's he's a film studies professor, I believe, specifically, despite the fact that, most of what he does is famous for his Hegel and Žižek studies. So I kind of expected a bit more finesse in the way he was going to talk about the themes. And he didn't. Like, for example, he half of his analysis has to do with the bureaucracy interpretation of the trial. Which, if anybody's heard of this book, the usual thing that they will hear about it, it's about this totalitarian bureaucracy, and it's very bizarre, surreal, and it's just about how a lot of this ends up being a nonsensical runaround, and how much of our world is just rules upon rules upon rules, which nobody understands. Nobody really understands, what the end is for. It's just, a blind process. If you read the story, I cannot understand how in the world you can get this interpretation. I really cannot, because the story is really about the main character, Joseph K. And Joseph K is a terrible person, like a terrible, terrible, awful person. He is not a good person at all. Very selfish, self-centered, rude, sexually harasses women, does not do very intelligent things. And a lot of people understand that he is some poor little guy, just being oppressed by this totalitarian system of a court that has charged him with something that he never gets to know. And the whole story is that, in the end, for those of you who have never heard of this, I don't even know how this could be a spoiler, because it doesn't actually spoil anything. He's found guilty in the end, guilty of what most people think you never find out. And he dies. And, what's the message of the story most people get is, well, life is a whole bunch of nonsense. There's things that are going to happen to you. You're going to be given the runaround. And if you ask, well, why? The answer is no reason. And you're screwed. Have fun. But like I said, if you read the story, it's very much about Kay. It's about who he is. And it's even stated a few times explicitly that whatever this trial is about who he is. And even when you don't pay attention that he was explicitly told this, there are many instances in the story in which you can tell that a lot of what happens is his own doing. It's his own negligence. It's his own self-assured understanding of things he doesn't actually know about. He assumes so many things about the court. He assumes so many things about his trial that he never bothers to actually go and ask anybody. He doesn't ask anybody for help. He doesn't ask anybody to explain to him explicitly what's going on. He has a chance, for example, in one of the chapters to meet a person in the court offices whom he's told, you can ask this person anything you want and they'll answer all the questions you could possibly have. That's their job. They're here to answer every question. And he decides not to ask this person ever. And he leaves that day and he never comes back, never decides to ask this person anything. He decides himself just to never find out because he just assumes, oh, well, they're not going to know anything anyways. They're not going to tell me anything useful. And so the fact that Todd McGowan takes this view that part of the importance of the story is this big other of a bureaucracy and how, the state becomes this independent mechanism which has no telos ultimately, that just, blindly works. Is such an external reading that it's very clearly a projection upon the text itself. The text itself does not give you any basis internally to itself to make this reading at all. The idea that, for example, the bureaucracy is oppressive is complete nonsense because every time you actually read in the story, the relationship that Kay has to the bureaucracy, they're all nice. They're all nice and they do everything to make him comfy and to let him know that anything he needs, they're on it. They'll let him, they let him get away with so much things. He's disrespectful. He is rude. He is disruptive to the proceedings themselves. And nonetheless, the court is very kind to him and lets him break a lot of rules in which he thinks he's going to be sneaking about behind the court to find out things that he assumes he shouldn't know. But every time he's given access to these things, they reveal things to him about the nature of the trial, and he completely misinterprets them. And that's on him. It's not on the court. And the court never holds this against him, by the way. He breaks, like in one of the chapters, he breaks into the courts, looks at the judge's books, which he's not supposed to. I mean, in any court trial, this would land you in jail for, not just contempt of court, but because, you're getting into confidential information that you should not be looking into. Nonetheless, the court officials allow him to do this, and nothing ever happens to him as far as he's aware. In that same day that he breaks into the court, another court judge, a student judge, comes in and knows that he has done this and doesn't do a thing about it, and just tells him, you should have just gone home the minute you realized I was here. And Kay decides to be rude and engage into an altercation over the strangest thing, over a woman that he's known for like 30 minutes, and he's just become like totally infatuated with, just sexually as well. And it's not mainly just sexually. He just wants to get a petty revenge on something that he thinks that a court judge did to insult him, which never even happened. Kay is just misremembering things. The only thing I could agree with Todd McGowan's analysis on this was that the other side of his analysis, the other half, is about how he realizes that a lot of this is a projection of Kay's part regarding his subjectivity, that, it's about, Todd McGowan takes a psychoanalytic reading of this, that, it's also a representation of guilt and the way in which, people who are guilty look guilty and draw problems to themselves. It's like somebody, he gives the example of that when you're stopped by cops, for example, and this is ideally, by the way, it's because, you look guilty, and it's because you're acting guilty. It's because, you're looking suspicious, as the police say often. And McGowan says, there's a truth to this. There are people who, even though they may not be conscious of it, they're acting guilty of certain things. And sometimes it is because they are. But beyond that, he doesn't get to the standpoint of understanding that the whole story, this does not cohere with a bureaucratic example. Like, they're two completely different analytic points, two different interpretations that don't really come together. They just externally come together. But if you look at the story as a unified whole, what you find is that this is a deeply religious, theological, and metaphysical story about what it is that we're supposed to do in this life. For those of you who are religiously inclined, I suggest you read this book. You read the Franz Kafka's The Trial, because it's a really good, I'd say, allegory of what most human issues are. I listened to your talk with Chad Hagen about the question about the sins, the order of the sins. And I was thinking about that in part of when I was reading this, in which, I think that you said that pride might be the first sin upon which all other sins are built on. And you can definitely notice that a huge issue with Joseph K., the main character of the trial, is he is extremely proud to the point where he believes he's a self-made man. He believes that he doesn't need anybody else. He doesn't need any friends. He doesn't need any family. And he alienates himself from everybody. And this is ultimately the origin of his trial. When you actually look at the events in the story, that he alienates everybody from himself, and he is an objectively lonely and sad and miserable person, but he's not even conscious of this. If you're aware of Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death, that there can be an objective aspect of despair. Joseph K. is in despair, and he does not consciously realize it, but he lives it. His life is alienated. He is alone, and he's just sinking deeper and deeper into this alienation. And the trial is precisely this event in his life that's happening because he has alienated himself. And all these events that are parts of the court are chances for him to realize that he's alienated, and of many people saying, you need to open up, you need to open up, you need to find your humanity in community. And he rejects this all the way until the end. He never understands this, despite the fact that throughout the story, he constantly has these moments in which, for all events that happens, there's two perspectives, and Kay almost always realizes these two perspectives, and he always chooses the one that is the selfish perspective, in which it aggrandizes him, and in which he puts himself in an oppositional relationship to whatever it is that's happened. You know, either he's putting someone down, or he's imagining that somebody else is putting him down. He interprets all kinds of help as like hidden attacks upon him. You know, for example, at his job, he keeps getting worse and worse because he gets caught up in his trial. He can't think of anything else. He can't do his job anymore. And instead of being fired at his job, his superiors just take the load of work off him. And Kay is caught up in this mentality that he's like, I could see this as them helping me or being nice, but he's like, but most likely what's happening is that they're really just taking away my work to make themselves look better, so they can take away my clients and they could take away my reputation. And then they'll say, like, you're not doing anything, Kay, and then they'll fire me. He doesn't realize that they're trying to help him. You know, there's so many people in the story that try to help him, and he doesn't realize it in the end. Funnily enough, this book made me reflect upon myself, and how, in many ways, not only are people in general, to some extent, like Kay, but how I'm like Kay. And this actually led me to an actual event in my life to face my own running away from guilt in certain things, and come up and there's in the story there's something called deferral, in which people are running away from their trial by playing this formal game of dealing with a trial by dealing with the superficiality that there's a problem there, and you just deal with the problem enough that you keep pushing it off. Basically, you keep pushing it off and never getting into it, and you think that you're going to win the trial by just never letting the trial move on into the next phase. And so I realized, in reading this book, that I had that reflection that there are things in my life in which I'm just pushing it off. I'm just deferring. And the reality is that for a lot of things, you just have to finally let it move on. You have to let it happen, and you have to see for yourself whether your fears are going to play out and whether your judgments were actually justified or not. Because there's a lot of things in which, for example, a lot of people do things in life out of fear, that they think certain things will happen, but they don't know this. And this mostly just comes up with personal problems. You think you're going to disappoint somebody. You think that something's going to happen regarding, something coming out, but you don't know this. And if you think about it, like you're in my situation, I thought about it. I have no basis for thinking what I'm thinking, because I've just assumed this. And a lot of what Kay does is just based on assumptions. He never tries. Part of the trial is that you have to make trials of your own. You have to try things to find out for sure what it is that's going to happen. And the big thing for this, the theological connection, is that life is itself one giant trial. A trial of what? What's God trying us for? In my reading, the great Hegelian understanding of things is the point of everything is freedom. The point of this life is to be free. So what did Kay fail at? He failed to be free, specifically in the form of a person. Because if you alienate yourself from society, if you alienate yourself from community, you're not a proper person. He fails to be a proper person. He fails to be a person at all in many ways. And in the end, he dies, and he realizes this. And he said his final words is like a dog, and that he feels that his shame is going to outlive him. And why? Because the only thing Kay ever did, and the only thing notable about Kay, is precisely this trial. Nothing else is known about his life, because he never did anything in his life, really. He never did anything with anyone. He had no friends. He had no great love of family. He focused on his job, but even in his job, he pretends that he was some great worker or anything, that he's like, this great person. But you find out that he's actually a really mediocre guy that is there because of nepotism, mostly. And because people just happen to like him for a strange reason, and they're very nice to him. And nobody tells him to his face that he's not all that great, you know? And it's brought up in the story itself that, you know, part of this is probably a problem with a lot of people as well, that a lot of people are just too nice with them and never put them on trial for things that they ought to have been on trial to begin with. You know, that if you're a terrible person, you ought to be told that you're a terrible person, and you ought to realize that. And if you know somebody who's terrible and you've never told them, and you know that nobody else has ever told them, probably the kindest thing you could do for this person is just tell them, you know, you're being a terrible person. And they might be shocked, they might be angry, but maybe that gets them to reflect on all these other things. So that's one thing in which, you know, art has a great place in the world, believe it or not, in the Hegelian understanding, despite the fact that people think that Hegel says art is dead and all these other things, and therefore, you know, there's no place for art after philosophy. Absolutely not. You know, art is taken up along with religion into philosophy. They're not things that are erased and negated. This is one of the things that, you know, the atheist readers of Hegel were just completely wrong with, because, you know, someone like Todd McGowan, who is an atheist, how can you call yourself a Hegelian in any way and think that religion is just negated, and that all you find out about religion is, oh, well, you know, ultimately this is just pictorial representation, and it is false. That cannot possibly be true if you understand things speculatively. You know, as he understands, the contradiction has to be taken up as what it is. So, you know, insofar as things seem incomplete, nonetheless they're taken up. This is true in the phenomenology as well, by the way. Despite the fact that natural consciousness is supposedly this false consciousness, it is a consciousness that we all exist with, and every moment is taken up. We always have sense certainty, we always perceive, we always understand, to a point where we're self-conscious, to a point where we're reasoning, to another point, you know, we're in community and all these other things. And so, you know, the fully actualized individual who reaches the standpoint of the idea carries the entirety of this historical understanding, both of themselves and of the world, and makes them a part of themselves, and not in a negative way, always in a positive way, so that they don't disappear, but they're put in their proper context. You know, that's what it is to take up the contradiction, to realize this is only a moment in the end. You know, being and nothing are just moments of becoming, and becoming is just a moment of everything else, of essence, idea, and all of this is just a moment of spirit. And it's a positive moment, not just a negative moment. To me, that's probably the greatest thing of Hegelianism, in which it has allowed me, given me a way in which to integrate everything positively, as opposed to just merely this negative thing of I'm not that, which in my view, is what people like Žižek and McGowan and Jay Bernstein, despite how positive they are, they still have a moment of finitude in which they're still putting something off, putting it to the side, and denying it any truth whatsoever.
Fantastic. And yeah, you've definitely convinced me to read the trial. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I certainly will now. Especially because you connected it to the seven deadly sins thing. That was great. And yeah, thanks for bringing it all back to Hegel. That was very nice. So yeah. I guess if that's all you have to say, then we can wrap this up now. Again, I want to say that I want to mention, as you mentioned, that the Hegel Encyclopedia you're working on, if anyone watching is interested in contributing to that, make sure to reach out to Antonio. And yeah, his blog and YouTube will be in the description, so I highly suggest you check those out as well. And also consider joining the Telos Bound Discord if you're interested in participating in some philosophy and theology discussions and stuff. But yeah, anything else you want to say, Antonio?
No, thank you very much for this discussion. I very much enjoyed it. I hope that I was more clear than not. Hopefully other people get enticed to look into Hegelianism on their own, either through my stuff or through anybody else's stuff, quite frankly.
Awesome. Okay, well, thanks for joining me, and thank you to everyone for watching.
All right, thank you. Goodbye.